Hello, everyone. You're in the Ether, and I'm your host, Cody Fry. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1. This is the beginning, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. It means a lot to have you all here with me, and this is going to be a lot of fun. You can find the Ether on iTunes, and it should also be up on Stitcher, Google Play, and the other popular platforms here very soon as well, so keep an eye out for that. You can also find the Ether on Instagram at ether_show. That's AETHER_show. Facebook page is currently underway, as is the website, theether.org. Excited about that one. Bear with me, that part's just a bit more of a process, but it is coming very soon. And as soon as I have something for you guys, I'll be sure to let you know. And if you just want to email me, it's theethershow, again, AETHER, theethershow@gmail.com. And guys, please don't forget to rate and review on iTunes. It just takes a minute, and it really is everything for a show like this, just starting out. The exposure is critical. The more people I'm able to reach, the better the experience is going to be for everybody, and the longer I'll be able to do it. It's not free to produce, so I just ask that you help spread the word if you can, and thank you so much in advance for that. So what's the Ether? Well, what I want to do with this show, guys, is give you some new and fresh perspectives, discussions, and commentary on phenomena that lie in the periphery of our reality. This is going to be things that range from near-death experiences to consciousness, the UFO phenomenon to paranormal activity, cryptids to spirituality. And I'm aware, of course, there is a lot of stigma and I suppose just overall craziness attached to these topics. But if you're anything like me, you've probably learned how to tune that out by now. And what I'm going to try to do is take an open, inquisitive, yet skeptical approach to these subjects and go from there. I think that's a good starting base because, look, these waters we're about to wade into here are pretty murky and complex on a good day, right? So I think we owe it to ourselves, as humans, as intelligent beings, to tread carefully, to be able to entertain an idea or a theory without fully believing it or railing against it. I want to leave myself open to what the witness, the person who experienced that event or saw that thing, I want to hear what they have to say. Because I think it would only make sense anyway, from my perspective, that we, the human beings, are all deeply connected somehow to all of these phenomena. I mean, we're the ones reporting these experiences, aren't we? And that's why I think the witness, the experiencer, the person telling the story is so important. Because, maybe the exact color of the light the person saw isn't as crucial of a detail as we once thought. Maybe, the width or height of an object isn't quite as important as what was that person's life like around the time of this event? What was going on? And what was going on prior? Okay, what was their life like before this happened? And what is their life like today? How has it changed? I don't know if we'll ever come to any definitive conclusions on this stuff, let's face it, but I think the phenomena reveal themselves in the details, in these strange little odds and ends and pieces that don't quite seem to fit or make sense. But when you compare these weird little detail among seemingly individual phenomena, the similarities are striking. I mean, there are parallels everywhere. If you're paying attention, it's hard not to notice. And that is the space that I find most interesting and the one we'll be exploring a lot on this show. So I hope that gives you at least a pretty good idea of the general direction I'm headed with this podcast. And keep in mind too that, your feedback and your participation, they're ultimately going to help shape what this show becomes as well. So I really can't wait to see, where we take this thing together, what it becomes. As far as what you can expect show content wise, I won't be sticking to any, real rigid format from episode to episode. For example, one week I may interview an author of a book, and the next I might just cozy up and tell you all a story. I want to try to keep it as fresh and relevant as I possibly can, and really focus on the delivery and the quality of the delivery to you. And I'd like to encourage you at this point, if there's a personal story or an experience you've had or somebody close to you that you feel comfortable sharing with me, please do. Even if it's just something you want to get off your chest without judgment, I'm all ears. Perhaps that's something we could even talk about on the show, even get you on to chat about it if that's the route you want to go. But yeah, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Now, in deciding what I wanted to do for the very first episode, I wound up going with a UFO story because For me, the UFO phenomenon was one of my early gateway phenomenons, to the other stuff. I guess it was just one of those things that just early on helped open my eyes to that other reality of things that I hadn't noticed that much before. So I thought it only fitting. And now this particular case, it's one that I personally haven't looked at a whole lot in the past. And I'm glad that I did, because now that I've had the chance to really analyze this from multiple sources, I found this to be an incredible story. Something strange happened in the Canadian wilderness back in 1967, and one man was witness to this event. This is the incident at Falcon Lake.
The craft lifts up 30 to 40 feet and vanished.
What happened to Mr. Mihalik back in 1967?
This story is about a man named Stefan Mihalik. Originally born in Poland in 1916, Stefan served with the U.S. Army occupation troops in Germany. Now, prior to this, he and his wife Maria, they'd actually both spent time detained in Nazi prison camps during the invasion. So unfortunately, wrong place and time in history for them, but thankfully they were able to both escape. And again, Stefan later returned with the Allied troops to help those that he could. And upon his discharge in 1948, Mihalik fled communist Poland and moved to Saskatchewan, Canada, working as a farmhand. Initially, he did have to make this move on his own, but eventually he was able to bring his wife and their 2 young children from Poland to Canada, and they soon had another son. By 1960, Stefan began working as an industrial mechanic in the city of Regina, before eventually transferring to Winnipeg, where, by all accounts, Mihalik lived a perfectly normal life with his family. We move forward now to 1967. Stefan is 51. His 2 oldest kids, Mark and Eva, are attending college, and his youngest, Stan, is 9 at the time. Now, Mihalik's always had a pretty strong interest in geology, minerals, and mining for ore. And by now, he's actually a pretty avid prospector and outdoorsman in pretty much all of his spare time. It is Friday, May 19th, and Stefan has a prospecting trip planned for that weekend. So he leaves work that afternoon from the cement company and goes home to finish packing. Later that same evening, his son Mark drops him off at the bus terminal, and Stefan boards a bus at 7:15 p.m. bound for Falcon Beach, Manitoba. Now, to give you an idea where this is located, it's 86 miles east of Winnipeg on the Trans-Canada Highway near the Ontario border, about 50 miles northwest of Minnesota. And Falcon Beach is on the western end of Falcon Lake in an area called Whiteshell Provincial Park. And this is a really remote region even today. The last census in 2016 counted a whole 272 people. So this area is just vastly uninhabited wilderness. It's covered with dense forests of pine and spruce, brushland, and small inland lakes. It is also part of what's called the Canadian Shield, which is a very large geological area that's rich in billions-year-old mineral ore deposits like gold, silver, nickel, quartz, etc. The glaciers from the Pleistocene era eventually moved through this region, scraping away all the soil, exposing the bare rock, and creating all the lakes we see there today. But moving on, Stefan arrives in Falcon Beach at 9:30 p.m. Friday night, and he checks into the Falcon Motel right off the highway. He goes over his maps and makes sure all his equipment is in order for the next day. Stefan goes to the motel coffee shop where he has a quick coffee and a burger. He makes small talk with a couple of employees, and he's in bed by 10:30. Stefan is up bright and early the next morning. He checks out of the motel since he's only planned a one-night stay, and carrying his brown leather briefcase filled with all his maps and tools, Mihalik begins to walk heading west along the Trans-Canada Highway for roughly a mile or so. He then turns off the highway and hikes north into the wilderness for approximately another mile and a half before he eventually arrives at a quartz vein next to a stream. This is a site that he had staked a claim on. At this point, he spooks a small flock of geese a couple hundred feet away in a nearby marsh, but apparently they get used to his presence and settle back down pretty quickly. And so using his geology hammer and his welding goggles to protect his eyes from the flying rocks, Stefan begins chipping away and taking samples of quartz from the rock ledge. After a while, it's about 11 a.m. He's been out in the wilderness for about 5 hours. He takes a quick lunch break. And as he's finishing up and putting his utensils and things back in his briefcase, the geese in the nearby marsh start making another commotion. But this time they seem quite a bit more disturbed and flustered than when they had first reacted to him there. And they fly off, and Stefan's a little concerned maybe there's a bear or some other predator nearby that's scared them off. It's at this point he happens to look up. And when he does, he sees a bright light moving in his direction, followed by a second bright light following the first one. As they approach from a southwesterly direction, These lights begin to take on a cigar shape. Neither make a sound. As they draw closer, they begin to take on more of an oval shape. Mahalik just stares in amazement and a bit of fear as they silently edge closer to him, maintaining the same speed and distance between one another the whole time. They're both rotating counterclockwise and emitting a glowing red color. It's not mentioned how fast they're traveling at this point, but once they're within 100 feet or so, still kneeling, Stefan sees them clearly now, and he realizes they're both disc-shaped crafts, not unlike your typical depiction of a classic flying saucer. One of the crafts then, making, as he calls it, a sort of electrical whirring sound, it lands on a bare section of an exposed rock ledge about 150 feet away from Mahalik. And as it does, he notices another whistling noise, and he can feel a sort of suction of the air around him. Meanwhile, the second craft just hovers 10 or so feet off the ground. It changes color from red to gray. Stefan continues to hide behind a rock ledge, and he observes, and some minutes pass, the craft that is still hovering begins to turn red again. It slowly rises and starts to go back in the direction it came from, again slowly rotating, and once it's a further distance away, it changes more to a bright orange, and then it accelerates out of sight at an incredible speed. Mahalik, even in all his years in the military and being an aviation buff, he'd never been exposed nor heard of anything that fast, let alone the description of the object. Stefan, still observing the other landed craft, he decides to grab his pencil and make a sketch of the object in his notebook since he doesn't have his camera. So it's circular with a dome on top. He estimates about 35 feet in diameter and about 8 to 10 feet high. The object is no longer rotating, and the outer body of the craft, what was once a bright red, almost like metal when it reaches really hot temperatures, is gradually fading into gray and then eventually what he describes as pale brass yellow, like hot stainless steel. So whatever this thing is, it's giving Stefan the distinct impression that it's cooling off. Now, the craft exhibits some iridescence, and the surface is, as he calls it, incredibly smooth, similar to reflective glass. It has no noticeable panels, rivets, nuts, or bolts. There's a purple light emanating from these slit-like openings beneath the dome on top of the craft. Stefan then hears a hissing sound, as if this object is taking in or dispensing air, and at this point he notices a really strong odor of sulfur. He notes that this craft, it's emitting heat by radiation and convection, as in the hot air is just blowing off this craft. He could feel it on his face and on his body as it's cooling off. After observing and sketching, making some notes over the course of the next 10 minutes, a hatch around 2 by 3 feet opens on the side of the craft. He sees an incredibly bright column of different shades of light coming from inside, which projects a sort of colored pattern on the ground. And these lights are so bright, Stefan tries using his special lenses and his goggles to try to view them, but even so, he's still seeing spots when he closes his eyes or turns away. They're just so intensely bright. Now, this thing's actually there for quite some time. Mahalik estimates at least 30 minutes, the hatch just left open. Eventually, of course, curiosity gets the better of Stefan, and he decides to approach the object. He now hears voices coming from the interior. He can't understand the language, though they do appear to be human voices. He notes one voice being considerably higher pitched than the other, as he calls it squeaky. His first impression is that maybe these are Americans testing some kind of experimental aircraft, and he wonders if they're having some technical difficulties here and if he should offer some help. Though he doesn't see any markings on the craft whatsoever to indicate, USAF, NASA, or otherwise. There's just nothing on it. So in English, he first shouts, "Okay, Yankee boys, come on out, and I'll give you a hand with your broken down flying machine." And the voices fall silent. Stefan then tries speaking in several other languages he knows, German, Italian, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and nothing. No reply. Stefan, still feeling the heat just, radiating off this craft, he notices a rectangular-shaped vent on the left side about 9 by 6 inches with rows and columns of openings about a 1/4 inch in diameter, arranged in kind of a grid pattern. Still wearing his protective prospecting gloves, Mahalik then reaches out and carefully touches the side of the craft, and almost immediately it melts the fingertip of his glove. The hatch then, much like the iris of a camera, abruptly closes. The object begins to turn red and rotate counterclockwise again. A bit alarmed, Stefan backs off about 6 or so feet, and the vent-like object he'd just been observing turns and swings directly toward him, and without warning, it shoots out a blast of heat, hitting him directly in the chest and stomach area, blowing him backward and onto the ground. His shirt and undershirt almost immediately catch fire. He tears them off and throws them on the ground. The craft then ascends as it kind of tilts to match the slope of the rock that it had been on, and then swiftly darts off just above treetop level. Again, Mahalik feels this rush of air, this suction as it departs, and he's only able to view it for a few moments before it changes again to a bright orange, and just like the first object, it accelerates out of sight at an impossible speed. Stefan then goes and stomps out his clothing before it starts a bigger fire. He notices his cap's been singed. There's a 10 to 15 foot circle where that craft had just been. It looks like the vegetation there had just been blown away quickly by something. And he goes to put on a light jacket that he'd packed, and he realizes now he's in quite a bit of pain as his chest and particularly his stomach had been burned pretty badly. And after 10 minutes, he becomes extremely sick, breaks out in a cold sweat, and starts vomiting. And there's also this strong odor, like burnt electrical wiring and motor smell and sulfur. It actually appears to be emanating from his own body, and he can taste it in his mouth. Meanwhile, he's also developed a strong headache, so Mahalik then picks up what's left of his burnt undershirt, and he ends up leaving the other shirt on the ground as it had almost been completely burned. He puts it in his briefcase along with the rest of his tools, and his hasty departure, of course, he ends up leaving behind his measuring tape, but he's got to get out of there. He pulls out his compass to try to get his bearings and see which direction he came from, but of course this compass is just spinning like a top. And to this day, not even his own son or anybody that investigated this case can really explain how he got out of there. It's almost a miracle in itself because this area is not easy to reach. It's not easy to get back from. And he's lost, he's disoriented, he's scared. But somehow, some way, luckily, he found his way back to the highway and started heading east back to Falcon Beach. Shortly after, coincidentally, a Constable Salotsky of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police happens to drive past Mahalik on the highway. Stefan frantically flags him down and tells him everything that had just happened. Now, details on this encounter, they're a bit fuzzy, so I'll just try and give you the cliff notes here. Mahalik, still in a state of shock and pretty incoherent, he explains to the constable that he's just seen 2 ships out in the woods. One of them has burned him. He's afraid he's been exposed to something, possibly radiation, and he's afraid he might expose others to whatever made him so sick. He even goes as far as refusing a ride back to the motel. But, of course, the constable doesn't quite know what to make of all this. In the end, he ends up driving off and leaving Mahalik to walk the remaining mile or so back to the motel, and he gets there by 4 p.m. Stefan then makes his way to the local headquarters of the RCMP to try to get some medical assistance, but apparently there's not a whole lot they can do for him. A bit desperate now, he returns back to the motel and he asks where the nearest hospital is, which is 45 miles in the opposite direction of Winnipeg. He realizes that won't work, so running out of options now, he asks if he can use the motel payphone, which he does, and he calls the Winnipeg Tribune newspaper. He tells them his story and asks if they can send a car to pick him up. Once again, he's told, well, no, we're shorthanded this weekend. We don't have anyone available. Concerned that they're just not interested, Stefan insists that he doesn't want the publicity, just the medical attention. But, of course, none of this pans out at the time. He ends up calling his wife, Maria. He tells her he's been injured while prospecting, but that he'd be well enough to take the next bus home. And that's just what he does. He walks outside, he goes to the bus terminal, and he waits. He ends up leaving at 8:10 p.m. that night, and he makes it back to Winnipeg by about 10:25, where his son Mark is waiting, and they drive straight to a local hospital where his burns are examined and treated. Not surprisingly, they don't know what's wrong with Stefan. They treat him for 2nd and 3rd degree burns, but they don't appear to be serious or life-threatening, so they release him to go home, where Mahalik continues to experience the pain, the nausea, the headaches. He can't eat. He can still taste and smell the burnt electrical and sulfur odor as if it was embedded in his body. Others around him, namely his family, they did report they could smell that as well. Now, as it turns out, the Winnipeg Tribune was in fact interested in Mahalik's story because the following evening, Sunday, May 21st, a Heather Chisvin from the paper interviews Stefan, and the story is published the following Monday with the headline, "I was burned by UFO, claims city man," followed by several more articles over the course of the next couple of months. So despite, his first impression, they appear to be quite interested in what he had to say. What soon follows is a frenzy of investigations conducted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and their Criminal Investigation Division, the Canadian Department of Defense, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the United States Air Force in conjunction with the University of Colorado Condon Committee, the Canadian Department of Mines and Natural Resources, the Whiteshell Nuclear Research Establishment, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, the Canadian Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization. And I could go on because there are so many more independent researchers and other bodies that investigated this story. And, since there are so many names and organizations involved here, I'm just going to condense the next part of this story for you. The RCMP and the RCAF, they conduct ground and air searches with no luck. They try and get Mahalik out there initially to search for this site with him, but he's too sick. After some weeks go by, he does accompany them, but they still can't pinpoint it. They may spot a landmark or two, but they just can't seem to find the site of the encounter. Some theories are espoused that maybe Mahalik climbed this tower and got electrocuted. Maybe it was the tower itself he'd seen in the distance. Maybe this, maybe that. Everyone, especially the Condon Committee, at this point is ready to brand this as a hoax and move on. They just think something's wrong with the fact that he hasn't found this place yet. But apparently Mahalik does find it on a trip that he'd personally made out there a few weeks later. This time, reportedly aided by a fellow from APRO, he's able to recover his measuring tape, the remains of his shirt. They took samples from the surrounding soil and the rocks for scientific testing. Of course, the authorities, they soon catch wind of this, and many tests to detect radiation are then performed at the site. His clothing was tested. Stefan himself was analyzed. Now, interestingly, Mahalik never does test positive for any radiation. In fact, his burns are later determined to be thermal in nature, not caused by radioactivity. However, test results from the site itself, different story. They do indeed find very high levels of radiation there. So high, in fact, they deemed it as a real threat at the time. The authorities almost shut the whole park down to the public for fear of exposure. And at this time, the RCMP is also investigating whether or not Stefan or someone else had removed radioactive waste from a local cancer clinic burial site, or if some other source of radiation had come from elsewhere by some other means. His family and friends were questioned many times. Everybody that came into contact with Mahalik surrounding the day of the event was questioned. Even members of APRO were investigated pretty thoroughly. Evidence from the site, it continues to get passed from one organization onto the next for more and more testing, and that goes on for quite a while. In the meantime, Mahalik, he's regained some of the strength and weight that he'd lost. He's feeling well enough to return to work, and his life returns to about as normal as it can, considering. I mean, keep in mind this case, it generated a lot of attention, both from governmental bodies and the media. Even Life magazine covered his story at the time. So this case had certainly taken on a life of its own, and it did so in a really short period of time. So, of course, this whirlwind effect, it really took its toll on Stefan and his family. His son Stan reports that oftentimes Stefan and his wife Maria would get into arguments over this, and she would say things like, "Why did you have to get burned by that thing?" And they didn't want the reporters on their lawn. They certainly wanted answers for Stefan's medical condition. And Stefan, of course, he's understandably compelled to share his story. I mean, if for no other reason than it's just so damn odd, he wants others to know about it. And I'm sure he wants to know what he saw, but they didn't want fame. They didn't want notoriety whatsoever. So we move forward now to about a year later. Stefan returns to the site with a friend, and he reportedly finds two of these sort of W-shaped silver bars. Both are highly radioactive. Both have been melted to a degree that nobody can explain, even if the whole thing were a hoax. According to Stefan, he found these in some kind of a moss-covered crevice that everybody had apparently overlooked. Author Chris Rutkowski, who co-authored a book on this subject, he actually possesses one of those pieces to this day.
And as for these pieces of metal, these are not chunks of radioactive materials as such. The piece that is currently still in our possession is about 4 inches long and is made of almost pure silver. The silver has radioactive materials attached to it, embedded in it, because the silver has been melted. This is completely not natural. To think that silver could be melted in any quantity in an isolated area in 1967 and then become radioactive because of materials. If it's a hoax, this is easily something that makes Billy Meyer look like child's play.
It's also around this time, about August 1968, that Stefan, unsatisfied with the health care that he's received in Canada, I mean, so far no one's given him any answers. He's still experiencing symptoms like fainting spells. The burns on his stomach and chest seem to heal slowly over time, but then flare up again in the form of some kind of, for lack of a better term, rash. So he checks himself into the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. His insurance doesn't cover it, so he pays out of pocket, and he's there as an outpatient for about 2 weeks, where a team of doctors give him a complete physical and psychological exam. It's said that Mahalik doesn't get these results back for about 16 months, that the Mayo Clinic at some point had told him, "We don't have you on record here. You've never been a patient here." And he ends up having to file a medical release form demanding the results. And once he does, no diagnosis. The best they can say is we think these burns are thermal, and it looks like he's having an allergic reaction to something. And that's pretty much where we leave this, because no further developments are ever made. This ends up being one of the most well-documented cases, UFO cases, of all time anywhere, yet not one person or organization could ever tell Stefan who or what he saw or experienced that day. His friends and family, they all maintain that Stefan, he would have told you the same story the year of his death in 1999 that he would have told 30 years prior. He never made one embellishment. And I want to mention too, because it's interesting, Stefan, though he did consider it, he never actually believed that the crafts or the occupants were extraterrestrial in origin. He always just assumed that, they were some type of experimental aircraft, possibly military. It's also important to mention at this point that every investigator that ever spoke to Mahalik, they came away convinced that he was a sincere, credible, honest individual. I mean, here's a person that's been through what he's been through in his life. What's the likelihood that he's going to create a fantastical story like this for fame or fortune? Not very high. They end up baffled just like the rest of us. And again, like I'd mentioned before, this case had generated so much attention. It just reverberated throughout his whole life, even late into his years. For example, in 92, Unsolved Mysteries interviewed Mahalik and featured his story. In 1996, A&E's The Unexplained featured his story. I believe even the reboot of Unsolved Mysteries talks about Falcon Lake as well. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with here is, if you recall, I brought up the author Chris Rutkowski a bit earlier. The book that he co-authored, it's called When They Appeared, and the other co-author is actually Stan Mahalik, Stefan's son. And it was released in 2017, published by McNally Robinson in Winnipeg. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find this book on Amazon. I believe there might be a site or two you could still purchase this from, but after writing the book, Stan and Chris, they appeared at a book signing. And the following audio is from Chris, just explaining something that happened at that event.
This very, very tall, elderly gentleman comes up and he turns to Stan Mahalik and he says, "It's a good book, but you spelled my name wrong." We look up at him, and he was one of the original RCMP investigators on the case 50 years ago, well into his 80s. He pulls out photographs that he himself had taken out at the site 50 years ago. He says, "I investigated this case thoroughly." He couldn't explain this case. He personally interrogated, not just interviewed, interrogated Mr. Mahalik 50 years ago. And in his opinion, Mr. Mahalik was telling the truth about what he had seen.
So here we have what on the outset appears to be a pretty common UFO tale, right? And these objects he claimed to see aren't that remarkable or unique in contrast to other reports. I mean, flying saucers, really. But if you look at the credibility of the witness, if you consider all the investigators and organizations who tried to prove Mahalik wrong and or crazy and could not, you have to raise an eyebrow. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty careful with the word believe or belief. When it comes to these subjects, I don't go all in on anything, but if I were pressed, I'd have to say I believe that Stefan saw what he says he saw. Now, what he saw, I mean, not even a clue, right? I mean, there's so many things to unpack here. I mean, first of all, what were these objects doing there? Why were they in this area? Did it have something to do with the geological makeup of this region? Were they there to mine something? Who are they in the first place? And what's going on with the voices? Why is one of them squeaky? Why can't he understand the language? He knows several. It's Canada. How many different languages do people speak in Canada in 1967? So what do we have here? Are these just people from some clandestine group from another country maybe, and they're out in the middle of the Canadian woods conducting a secretive experiment or test? Maybe. But what are the odds that they're just going to run into good old Stefan Mahalik out in the middle of nowhere and he's just going to witness the whole event? In all fairness, there was quite a bit of turmoil going on around that period in time. For example, the United States, they were involved in a terrible bloody war in Vietnam. The Cold War was raging on as strong as it ever had been. And maybe somebody sent some experimental aircraft / weapon out to a quiet place to test it. That's a possibility. We can't discount it. I can't say how likely that is. It's not for me to say, but I don't think we can just throw it out. Now, if we allow ourselves to speculate far enough to say, well, maybe these were ETs, well, that would invite a whole lot of questions now, wouldn't it? Not the least of which, again, my mind would go to what were they doing there? And the whole mining for gold Anunnaki theory, you know that one. It's nice. And there was a time where I may have entertained that theory more than I do today, but I'm going to need a little more evidence to support that theory before I transpose it with this story. You know what I mean? I think that's a mistake. But let's just suppose it's true. Let's say aliens come here to mine for our resources. Okay, but then why? Isn't the universe teeming with the basic building blocks of matter and life, such as nickel, iron, gold, silver, etc.? Why Earth? And more, if these were ETs or just, I don't know, some beings from elsewhere, did they really come all this way to obtain raw physical materials? Or were they here specifically to interact with Mr. Mahalik? And if it's the latter, well then why was there no communication between Mahalik and whoever or whatever was inside this craft? And did they really have to burn the guy and make him sick when they left? What was the point of that? Is this some kind of a trickster entity phenomenon thing that just decided to screw with the poor guy that day? I mean, perhaps. What about the ultra-terrestrial theory, that they've been here all along and it's just some species so highly evolved and advanced beyond us that we only catch fleeting glimpses of them from time to time? I mean, sure, it's part of Jacques Vallée's most famous book title, right? Passport to Magonia, From Folklore to Flying Saucers. You know, maybe this highly evolved species has always existed among us, been here long before us, that they've appeared to us in many forms over the years, such as gods, angels, demons, fae folk, aliens, etc. I guess that'd mean they don't have to travel very far to interact with our dimension, our vibrational level, or, what we know as reality. Again, though, I'd have to ask, why did these super smart evolved beings burn a man with their flying saucers exhaust? I mean, doesn't that whole sentence just kind of sound wrong? And I think it's fair, too, to point out that the Falcon Lake encounter wasn't the only strange, unexplained event to have occurred around this time period in general area, because in 67 alone, let's see, August, Duhamel, Alberta, many UFOs are witnessed and reported over the course of several weeks. They're all over the newspapers. A farmer finds crop circles in his field. It's investigated by the Department of National Defense. It's kind of a big deal at the time. Another incident you might be more familiar with took place later that year in October, Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia. Strange lights seen above and diving into the water. You've probably heard of that one. Both cases thoroughly investigated, but unsolved. Now, are all these occurrences tied together, related to each other in some way, somehow? I don't know about that. That's a good question, but I don't know. It seems like maybe a bit of a leap in logic, but we can't rule it out either, because look, over the course of just a few months here, we've got some pretty strange yet similar events occurring here, don't we? I mean, maybe it's not the next town over, but it's still the same general region of North America. So, I mean, as much as some of us may want to discount that, sorry, can't do it, because until it can be disproven, it's got to stay on the table as at least a valid possibility. Now, in the spirit of entertaining all theories and possibilities here, let's just say for a moment this whole thing was a hoax. Okay, so here we have a blue-collar mechanic who experienced and witnessed firsthand the horrors of World War II, the concentration camps, the ugliness of that affair. The man who escaped a communist regime and wanted a better life for his family. And hey, on that note, I want to throw something out real quick because I almost forgot earlier, and I think this is relevant now because in 92, when Unsolved Mysteries interviewed Stefan, the producer kind of sidled up next to him and said, wow, this must have been the most incredible, frightening experience of your whole life, right? Mahalik just looked him dead in the eyes and said, no. And then he told him about World War II. So look, I mean, as much as I hate, just throwing possibilities aside when especially I don't know anything about this man, I've never investigated the case, but I gotta call BS on that. I'm sorry. I don't buy that Stefan Mahalik staged this whole elaborate, insane series of events. What did he do? Did he rub radioactive waste on his body? How did he burn himself in such an odd way? And with what tool or tools did he do that? Did he expect to make $1 million off of his 40-page book? How did he produce these silver bars that were apparently so pure silver that no one had ever seen anything like it before? And how did he embed them with radioactive material? How did he do it? Why did he do it? I don't know where I personally stand on this one, guys, and I'm curious to know what you think, but I'm at least comfortable siding with, decades upon decades of combined law enforcement experience that personally investigated this case and their conclusion was that Mr. Mahalik was telling the truth. These are the same people that tried to prove him wrong, that tried to explain his event away as something else for years, and they never could. No one's ever successfully been able to dispute any part of his story. There are a couple of questions that come up, for me, namely, like, how did this crack team of investigators come in and totally miss these highly radioactive, strange silver bars, and then Mahalik just comes in later with a Geiger counter and nails it? I mean, that's not explained. And unfortunately, there are always going to be aspects like this to cases such as these that we just can't explain away. And that's where I'm going to conclude this thing, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this story, this very first episode. Reach out to me. I'm curious to know what you think about this case. And again, if you have any personal stories or experiences of your own, please feel free to share them with me. Now, I will be updating my contact info here relatively soon, but for now, just go ahead and email me at theethershow@gmail.com. That's TheAether show, theethershow@gmail.com. And I look forward to hearing from you. So thanks again for joining me in the ether. We'll see you next time.